Today I will be talking about HIV transmission in the case of Johnson Aziga. What is HIV and AIDS? HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and AIDS stands for Acquired Immunodeficiency Virus. It is a disease transmitted through unprotected sexual intercourse, sharing unsterilized needles and syringe injections, and being a baby of an infected mother during pregnancy. This is a lentivirus, which means slow virus, and it attacks the immune system. The year 2012 marks the 30th anniversary of AIDS, which means it has been 30 years since the first official case of HIV was diagnosed. The earliest fully documented case of HIV goes back to 1959. A Congolese man's blood sample from a medical study was preserved, found, and then analyzed in 1998. It was verified that he had been HIV positive. But the first official case of HIV was reported on June 5, 1981. Even though there has been a lot of progress in finding a cure or even slowing down the virus, people all over the world are still living with AIDS. There are medical researchers trying to find ways to effectively prevent HIV, modify healthcare, and organizations raising money to find a cure. Intentional HIV transmission is a very big concern. If the offender is caught, he would be found guilty because there are many laws prohibiting the intentional spread of this disease to protect all others. Johnson Aziga is one of the most popular cases because he infected not only one person but 11 people. Now I will show you a video of his case.
Aziga guilty of murder and aggravated assault for infected women with HIV. Aziga continued to have unprotected sex after he had repeatedly warned that he carried the virus. When asked by his sex partners, he lied. 2 women died. 7 others are now infected. The Canadian case marks the first time that anyone has been convicted of murder by using HIV.
No, there's no doubt about that at all. He was diagnosed back in 1996. A few years after that, he started sleeping with many women and knew of his status and openly lied to all the women and he put it back on.
A landmark trial is now underway in Hamilton. An HIV-positive man is facing murder charges in the deaths of 2 former lovers. Prosecutors say he knowingly had unprotected sex, passing the virus on to both women. In a Canadian first, he was charged with first-degree murder. The CDC's Neil Tuxell is in the courtroom today. Duty to disclose. Those are 3 words that really sum up the crux of the Crown's opening remarks here today, and really the basis for their case here in Hamilton. They say Johnson Aziga was tested back in 1996 and knew he was HIV positive, but that he continued to have unprotected sex with a number of partners all the way up until his arrest in August of 2003. They say that the jury will be hearing from a number of the women that Johnson Aziga had relationships with. Many of the women expected to testify that they specifically asked Aziga about his sexual health and that he repeatedly told them he was healthy.
On April 4, 2009, Johnson Aziga was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 10 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of attempted aggravated sexual assault. He was given a diagnosis of HIV from his family doctor in December of 1996. At the time, he was married, and he and his wife were both given counseling on safer sex practices. After his divorce, he had unprotected penetrative sex with the 11 victims without telling them that he was HIV positive during the time period of May 2000 to August 2003. On October 16, 2002, Aziga was advised by public health officials that they were concerned with his sexual activities because an individual who had gotten recently diagnosed as HIV positive named him as one of her partners. Johnson Aziga was not being honest with the public health officials in regard to the fact that he was sexually involved with the 11 women since his diagnosis. He only admitted to being with 1 other woman since his divorce from his wife. On October 17, 2002, the offender was served with a Section 22 under the Health Protection and Promotion Act at his home. This required him to inform any partner of his HIV status before having sexual activity, to wear a condom, and to provide the public health department with the names and contact information with whom he was involved in penetrative sexual activity since 1996. On August 21, 2003, Aziga was served with another section of 102 of the Health Protection and Promotion Act. Finally, on August 30th, 2003, he was arrested. This paper will mostly focus on the following questions. Should someone with HIV be required by law to disclose this information to all his or her sexual partners? Is this somehow ignoring the human right to privacy? Is it really his fault for not telling the woman he had AIDS, even though it is their responsibility to ask him to her protection, knowing that there is always a risk of getting a sexually transmitted disease? When it comes to human rights, there are many laws associated with HIV transmission. One such law is the Public Health Act 1984. Section 35 states that one should have compulsory medical examination. Section 37 allows for compulsory removal to hospital. And Section 38 for enforced incarceration in hospital if a public officer believes those steps are necessary to prevent the spread of the disease. A person who infects their partner without letting them know that they risk getting infected with HIV would be found guilty under the Offenses Against the Person Act 1861 on the grounds of sexual assault, and causing actual bodily harm. Section 74 of the Sexual Offenses Act 2003 states that a person consents only if he agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. In the 2003 Act, Section 76 provides that the victim can be deceived as to the nature and purpose of the sexual act consented to. That is the victim's own prerogative to exercise skepticism when being influenced by the defendant. Section 20 of the Offenses Against the Person Act 1861 states that whoever shall unlawfully and maliciously wound or inflict any grievous bodily harm may be inflicted where the accused has directly inflicted it, or where the accused has inflicted it by doing something intentionally which is not in itself a direct application of force to the body of the victim. Lastly, Section 752 of the Criminal Code states that if the offender is a threat to life, safety, or physical or mental well-being of other person, or showing failure to restrain his or her behavior, and the likelihood of causing death or injury to other persons, or inflicting severe psychological damage on other persons, or if the offender has shown a failure to control his or her sexual impulses and causing evil to other persons. When analyzing Johnson Aziga's case, and after learning all the laws related to his crime, one realizes that Section 38 was applied to Mr. Aziga. During his supervised probationary period, he was not forced to go to the hospital, but he was very much watched by the public health officers. They tried their best to ensure that Mr. Aziga was not left alone with any women by watching him and making many visits to his house. They did this to prevent the spread of the disease. The only problem with this is that they couldn't always tell who he was with at every second of his moment of his life. Aziga was also found guilty under Section 752 of the Criminal Code, Section 20 of the Offenses Against the Person Act 1861, and on the grounds of assault and causing actual bodily harm. The reason why he was convicted under Section 752 was because he did not disclose his status as HIV positive to his partners, and sometimes was in denial of his status. He was a threat to the lives of others. He caused those 11 women psychological as well as physical problems. Also, his failure to restrain his behavior with the women caused them injury and 2 deaths. Second, he was found guilty under Section 20 because he maliciously inflicted his partners, and it was seen to be intentional because he was warned multiple times to disclose his partner's information, and he denied what he was being accused of. When it comes to privacy laws, in the Human Rights Act 1998, Article 8 of the Convention states that 1. Everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. 2. There shall be no interference by a public authority with the exercise of this right except as in accordance with the law and is necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, public safety, or the economic well-being of the country, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health and morals, or for the protection of rights and freedom of others. This article corresponds to Aziga's case because interference by a public authority was permitted since he was a threat to public safety, protection of health and morals, and the rights of freedom of others. When it comes to the question of consent and law, it is always hard to tell what is considered to be consent. To consent to something, one must know the facts about the other person's health and the risks they take if they have sexual relations. In the case of HIV transmission, consent to having unprotected sex is rarely given because no one would consent to inflicting themselves with a life-threatening disease. In order to consent to contracting HIV, the victim's consent must be informed and the defendant must have an honest belief in the consent. If the defendant concealed his HIV from his partner, that means she is automatically deceived because she cannot give consent to something she is ignorant of. A defendant can say his victim consented to sex without him having to tell her directly that he was HIV positive, as if he was in the hospital and they have friends in common. He can use the fact that he thought she knew as his defense. Another conflicting argument is where to place the blame. Does the person who consents to having unprotected sex also consent to the risks of sexually transmitted infections? The courts have rejected a shared responsibility approach, in which any consent in sexual activity is understood to include consent to all risks. Instead, the conclusion has been that the person who is aware of the heightened risk, inevitably the HIV positive partner, bears the primary responsibility to inform his or her partner. On the whole, when one's action becomes a threat to another person's life, it goes from a private matter to a public matter. There is also a problem with privacy when it comes to facilitating HIV disclosure to your partner, friends, and family. Disclosure is defined by the process of revealing a person's HIV status, whether positive or negative. Disclosure is considered a way of opening up to the HIV epidemic and a step toward ending stigma and discrimination against people living with HIV and AIDS. There are ongoing debates about the roles of health workers when it comes to their patient's choice of disclosure. Sometimes health workers are forced to tell their patients' loved ones without their consent that he or she has been infected with HIV, and this only happens when they see the person as a threat. Studies done in the United States found that African Americans disclose less often than other ethnic groups because individuals from racial and ethnic minority groups fear stigmatization if they admit that they are HIV positive. Johnson Aziga, born in Africa, claims to have also been scared to disclose his status to his partners because he feared rejection, improper and inadequate counseling, cultural religious background, stigma, and loneliness. Fear of stigma is thought to discourage disclosure. Health workers' facilitation of disclosure is limited by the potential for discrimination at health facilities and the limited counseling abilities of many health workers. The ethical dilemma here is privacy, the confidentiality of the patient's information versus the need to inform and protect others. In the end, Johnson Aziga recklessly transmitted his HIV virus to 11 of his sexual partners because he infected his victims with a grave disease he knew he had and put their lives at risk. His response to the Section 22 order in 2002 and the Section 102 order in 2003, combined with the counseling he received at Hamilton Public Health, was continued non-disclosure of his HIV status and unprotected sexual activity. Johnson Aziga was guilty under Section 75 of the Criminal Code, Section 20 of the Offenses Against the Person Act 1861, and the Article 8 in the Human Rights Act 1998. When it comes to consent, it can only be given when one knows the risks behind their actions without being deceived by their partner. In Johnson Aziga's case, consent was not given. Therefore, this went against human rights. Finally, the primary responsibility to inform his or her partner about the risks is the person who is aware of the heightened risk, inevitably the HIV partner, in this case, Mr. Aziga. Because HIV is associated with sexual behavior and drug use, it has been and continues to be highly stigmatized. The end.